Greetings and welcome back, gentles and ladiesmen, to another installment of Remake or Rebreak, a review segment where I take a look at the classic games of the past to see how well they hold up today, with a special emphasis on how well their subsequent ports, remakes, or re-releases improve upon the original experience. Today we're going to be talking about Metroid II: Return of Samus for the Game Boy, as well as a recently released fan remake for PC. Without further ado, let's jump right in. Metroid II was developed by Nintendo R&D 1 and initially released in North America in 1991. A sequel to the original game on NES, and following the Prime sub-series on the official series timeline, Metroid II follows up in the events of the first game. The bounty hunter Samus Aran has successfully derailed the plans of space pirates on the planet Zebes to clone an army of Metroids for use as bioweapons. Metroids, for the uninitiated, are jellyfish-like creatures which can latch onto prey and suck their life force dry. Now keenly aware of the threat these creatures pose to galactic security, the Galactic Federation once again enlists the services of Samus Aran, who is commissioned to infiltrate the Metroid homeworld of SR-388 and eradicate the Metroid menace once and for all. Fast forward to 2004 and the Metroid series has come a long way. 1994, Super Metroid completely revamped the Metroid formula and established many of the series conventions we know today. 2002's Metroid Prime gracefully transitioned the series from a side-scrolling platformer to a first-person adventure, and showed that there was a bright future for additional 3D games in the series. Finally, in 2004, Nintendo revitalized the NES Metroid as Metroid Zero Mission on the GBA, a complete overhaul of the 1986 original with much improved graphics, sound, level design, bosses, and so much more. One of the best remakes of all time, Zero Mission, at least in my opinion, perfected the 2D formula and showed how much potential there was for future side-scrolling games in the series. Naturally, you'd think a remake of Metroid 2 would be a no-brainer, but unfortunately, Nintendo hasn't seen fit to release a new 2D Metroid game since Zero Mission launched in 2004, and hasn't released a proper Metroid sequel of any kind since 2010. Enter Milton Huasti, aka Doctor M64, a sound engineer from Argentina who has since become an experienced game designer. While playing around with Game Maker in the mid-2000s, Doctor M64 became comfortable enough with the program's inner workings to start his first real project, a full-fledged remake of Metroid II: Return of Samus. Having announced the project in 2006, Doctor M64 has been documenting the remake's development on his blog for almost a decade. He began by replaying the original and getting a feel for what made the game so quintessential, before replaying many of the sequels to figure out what he wanted to change or add in his own remake. Ultimately, Huasti's goal was to give Metroid 2 the Zero Mission treatment, by recreating the graphics with a similar art direction, updating Samus's controls and mechanics to feel more like the GBA games, and to redesign the game layout to make it more conducive to speedrunning. Dr. M64 eventually enlisted the help of other sprite artists, writers, and musicians to help bring the project to completion. After close to 10 years of development, the project, called Another Metroid II Remake, or just AM2R for short, was finally released to the general public in August of 2016. If you're an avid Metroid fan like me, chances are you've heard of this project and have been following it for quite a while now. Having devoured each demo as they've come out and always wanting more, it was truly exciting to finally get my hands on a copy and play the whole game for myself. Truth be told, that's why I haven't done a Metroid marathon up to this point. I was waiting for this game to come out. I don't want to make a habit of reviewing fan remakes on this segment, because in some ways it isn't fair to the original version. But AM2R is simply too special for me to ignore. That being said, it's time to see how AM2R stacks up with the Game Boy original. This is Metroid II: Remake or Rebreak. Given how different these two games are, it makes more sense to approach them individually rather than alternating between them like I usually do. So we're gonna start with the original. Being a Game Boy title, the graphics are obviously in black and white, but as with all Game Boy games, you can play the game with some color if you pop the cartridge into your Game Boy Color or Game Boy Advance. That's why I'd actually recommend buying a cart for this one, because, like the other Game Boy games I've reviewed on this channel, the 3DS Virtual Console version only lets you choose between two monochromatic palettes. Speaking of which, a Metroid 2 port for the Game Boy Color was planned, similar to Link's Awakening DX, but was never finished. Overall, the graphics are the definition of a mixed bag. Some of the sprites look really good, some look pretty ugly, some background set pieces are detailed and look nice, others are bland and uninteresting, etc. Art direction wise, there's some diversity in the environments, but mostly you're just traveling in different cave tunnels for most of the game, with the occasional temple or Metroid nest to shake things up. It's not like the original game, where all the environments were visually distinct and memorable for the most part. To give credit where it's due, the game does make good use of contrast. contrast, so it's easy to tell what's in the background and what's in the foreground. But that's only because the backgrounds are always a blank void of nothingness. SR388 is a dark cave planet, so it makes sense, but compare these backgrounds to that of Super Mario Land 2 and you can see why I'd expect better. The music is also pretty hit or miss. The game's main theme, Surface of SR388, is one of my favorite tracks in the entire series. I dare say it's better than Brinstar from the first game. The Chozo Temple theme is also a serviceable track that keeps your brain from going numb. When the soundtrack tries to have an actual melody, it gets the job done just fine. But when it tries to be atmospheric, it's almost half as bad as Moonlight Museum. These other tracks are either completely uninteresting to listen to, or they're just ear poison. I get that the developers were going for ambience here, but I feel that the original game not only did that better, but did so while also having memorable, catchy melodies. Gameplay-wise, Samus controls more or less as she did before, but she can now duck to shoot enemies on the ground and shoot downwards while jumping. While these two changes don't sound like much, it makes Metroid II so much more playable than the NES game was. Now, I don't have to duck and drop bombs to kill enemies along the ground. Thank fucking Hylia. Nevertheless, there are a number of control quirks that do get on my nerves. I don't mind not being able to shoot diagonally, but it really annoys me that you're not allowed to activate your morph ball in midair, or that mistiming your button presses with the space jump causes you to drop like a rock, or that to attach the spider ball to a surface you have to press down, which pushes you away from ceilings, etc. The controls are very workable, but for me, controlling Metroid 1 and 2 after having played Super Metroid and beyond is like learning to drive a stick shift when you've been driving an automatic for your whole life. You don't realize just how much you take that extra convenience for granted until it's taken away from you. The core gameplay is fairly similar to that of the first game, but also brings along a few twists. Your main goal is to kill every Metroid on planet SR388, who have made their nests in the gigantic cave system below the planet's surface. As established in Metroid Fusion, Metroids undergo a unique life cycle when they're allowed to mature on this planet's surface. Turns out the jellyfish form from the original was just the larval stage. Given time, they'll mutate into alpha, gamma, zeta, and finally omega forms, which get stronger, beefier, and more aggressive with every mutation. Surprisingly, there are very few larval Metroids in Metroid 2. Most encounters are of the mutant variety, which make up the only bosses in the game, if you can even call them that. For the most part, all you have to do is keep pelting them with missiles until they drop dead, with each form requiring more and more ammunition to take out. All I can say is that I hope you're finding every missile expansion that you can. Otherwise, you run the risk of running out in the middle of a Metroid fight and having to backtrack to a good farming spot. Thankfully, the developers did include recharge stations this time, which cuts down on the needless, constant pickup farming that all but killed the NES game for me. Metroid 2 also brings back the save feature from the Famicom version of Metroid 1, which means you no longer have to write down absurdly long passwords just to continue with all of your upgrades. While these are appreciable improvements, the issue of keeping a good energy and ammo stock persists nonetheless. For the most part, save stations are placed in centralized locations where you'd think to look for them, but recharge stations are often stuck in side pathways that aren't exactly convenient to reach in the first place, and good luck remembering where they are when you inevitably have to backtrack for supplies. Almost inevitably, you're gonna have to grind at some point in your adventure, and just like in the NES game, it takes forever. Even though the game knows I'm low on missiles or health, it often drops the opposite of what I need, or nothing at all, and the pickups themselves barely give you anything back to begin with. This issue does greatly diminish after you get the Varia suit, but the first chunk of the game can be a big turnoff for newer players. What also hasn't gotten any easier by my third playthrough is keeping track of where I'm going. Metroid 2 forces you along a specific path and has a formulaic layout. SR388 is mainly laid out along a central tunnel which snakes deep under the planet's surface and then loops around close to where your ship is. Thing is, much of this tunnel is filled with magma, forcing Samus to go into the various temples and Metroid nests that branch off from the main tunnel. Most of the areas in Metroid 2 follow the same formula. A big, open, dome-like cave with the Chozo Temple in the middle with Metroid breeding grounds close by. To finish off all the Metroids, you'll have to scavenge for Chozo artifacts to upgrade Samus's power suit, so you can reach those Metroids you couldn't get to before. Some noteworthy additions of the first game include the Spider Ball, which would later reappear in the Prime games, and the Space Jump, which allows Samus to repeatedly jump in midair to reach higher areas. You're still only allowed to pick one beam upgrade at a time, but at least Metroid 2 allows you to switch back to your preferred beam at multiple locations. Whenever you kill all the Metroids in the area, an earthquake will strike, lowering the magma and allowing you to access deeper parts of the tunnel. Because Because of that, progression in Metroid 2 is based more on clearing set gates than it is about finding items that let you advance further, which is naturally going to turn some people off. On the bright side, there's still plenty of exploration to be had and secret pickups to find, so it's not a total betrayal of the Metroid formula. What's also nice is that backtracking is fairly minimal, so unlike the first Metroid Prime, I always felt the game was moving forward at a steady clip. Ultimately, whether you'll enjoy exploring in Metroid 2 boils down to preference, but I think that most people will find something to enjoy here. Nevertheless, trying to play this game without a built-in map system is just a huge hassle. While this game is definitely more straightforward in design than the first one, the layouts for some of these areas can still be really confusing. Metroid 2 is not as guilty of recycling rooms as the NES game, but a lot of areas can still feel really samey. The game's also guilty of crisscrossing rooms, like this part in the final Metroid nest, where you go down a shaft, go right, and then go up and through a perpendicular tunnel that you just went through earlier. Much like Klonoa Heroes, it's perfectly possible to finish this game without a map, but Metroid 2 really begs for one, so I suggest using the map browser in Metroid Recon to make your life easier. I know there's a minority of people out there who prefer not having a map, but as for me, it feels like a serious shortcoming. Overall, Metroid 2 is a mixed bag, just like the NES original, but I still think it's a sizable improvement. The level design does take a step backwards in being less open-ended, but also takes several steps forward by making rooms look unique and for being easier to navigate than the original overall. The addition of a save system, as well as recharge stations, also help to somewhat alleviate the farming issue from the original, while the improved control makes Samus a lot more fun to play as. For these reasons, I'd much prefer to revisit Metroid 2 on Game Boy than I would Metroid on NES. But I still don't think either of them are particularly great installments in the series. Like with the first game, I respect Metroid 2's legacy and its impact on the series, but just because it's an important game doesn't mean it isn't dated. I can only recommend the original Metroid 2 to fans of the series. Newcomers should steer clear. That being said, let's talk about the remake. Right off the bat, AM2R ups the ante with an intro cutscene, which is faithful to the story description in the original manual while still leaving room for the Prime sub-series to take place earlier on the timeline. One interesting change to the plot is the addition of a secondary objective. The original manual mentions a team of researchers who went missing when the Federation attempted to survey whether Metroids remained on SR-388, as well as a search and rescue team that was sent to extract them when Federation HQ received a distress signal from the research team. Much like the space pirates in the NES game, you never come across any Federation officers in the actual game. In AM2R, Samus is charged with verifying the status of these missing Federation personnel, in addition to exterminating all the Metroids, making them a minor plot point in the remake. One thing I hated about Other M is that it likes to pretend the Prime trilogy never happened, ostensibly because it was made by Gaijin from Texas and not the Nihongo. AM2R, in contrast, references details from the lore in those games, such as super missiles being able to break cordite crystals. The game even includes a scan log for reading about the story, enemies, bosses, and various locations of SR-388. Nintendo should really be taking notes here, because this is a great compromise between the fast-paced 2D gameplay and the slower-paced world building of the Prime trilogy. The graphics have obviously received a massive upgrade, with an aesthetic in the vein of Metroid Zero Mission. While some sprites and backgrounds are reused from that game, the vast majority of the assets in this game are custom made by Doctor M64's team of sprite artists. Many of the enemies and bosses in this game use some impressive looking multi-sprite effects, which fits the GBA inspired aesthetic very well. The animations for many of these enemies look fluid and convincing as well. The game is also technically solid, offering a classic 240p resolution at a smooth AF 60 frames per second. The art direction has been substantially improved as well. Whereas most of the environments in the original mostly blended together, every single room in AM2R looks visually distinct and stands out. The different Chozo temples from the original game all had a similar look and used the same musical track, whereas AM2R reimagines them as various facilities powering an ancient Chozo civilization. The first temple has been loyally remade in the style of the Chozo ruins from Zero Mission, while the second temple, for example, has been reimagined as a water purification plant providing water to other Chozo facilities on SR-388. All of these reimagined areas are also fairly new ideas for the series, which is keen to reuse the same jungle, fire, and ice worlds we've already seen a million times. Looking at you, Other M. It shows just how much potential there is for new areas in future Metroid games. The soundtrack, arranged by Doctor M64 and some additional musicians, is massively improved as well. Like I said before, Doctor M64 once made a living as a sound engineer, and it really shows in the music and sound design. Many of the tracks from the original game have been given a Metroid Prime treatment. The Metroid battle theme, which was one of the most grating tracks to listen to in the original game, has become one of my favorite boss themes in the entire series, and each Metroid mutation gets its own variant of the theme. Just as the look of the later Chozo temples has changed, so too has the background music, which offers some clever rearrangements of songs from Super Metroid and Metroid Prime 2 echoes. Even the half-baked 8-bit ambience from the original game has received a much-needed upgrade, and now actually instills a sense of isolation. On top of all this, the music team has also composed a number of original tracks, which fit the style of the rest of the game perfectly. In terms of gameplay, the biggest difference right off the bat is the control. Doctor M64 set out to make Metroid II control like Zero Mission, and he succeeds with flying colors. I've played through Zero Mission a million times, and I hardly noticed a difference. You can now aim diagonally, jump off of walls, grab ledges, etc. All of those niggling control quirks from the original game have also been fixed. You can activate the morph ball in midair, the spider ball has its own button, and the space jump isn't so damn picky about the timing. The game also includes a number of options to make the control more comfortable for everyone. You can choose to make weapon switching and diagonal aiming more like Super Metroid or more like Zero Mission. There's support for Xbox 360 controllers and other joypads, and there's even a number of neat new features that you can turn on or off in the options menu. Not only does AM2R control perfectly, but it lets you play the game the way you want to play it, which I think everyone can appreciate. While the look of all these areas is very different, the overall layout is more or less the same as it was in the original, and having to hunt down all the Metroids in a given area before you can proceed has been carried over as well. In this version, the Metroid counter keeps track of how many Metroids there are in a given area, instead of giving you one counter of every Metroid in the entire game, but you can change it back in the options menu if you want. The issue with farming supplies or tracking down recharge stations has been completely alleviated. Much like Metroid Prime 3 and Other M, save and recharge stations have been combined into one, allowing you to recharge your supplies quickly and painlessly. As you'd expect, AM2R introduces a much needed map feature a la Super Metroid in the GBA games. This makes it much easier to keep track of where you're going and to find that one Metroid you happen to miss. While the game world is still fairly straightforward in design, AM2R does implement some backtracking for those players looking for more exploration, especially those players looking to achieve 100% completion. This is largely thanks to the addition of returning Metroid staples, like super missiles, power bombs, the gravity suit, and the speed booster, all of which wouldn't debut until Super Metroid. Speaking of the speed booster, there are some good Shinespark puzzles here for Zero Mission veterans like me, but unlike that game, there aren't nearly as many of them and they don't overstay their welcome. While the backtracking had the potential to be really annoying, considering the linearity of Metroid 2's layout, Doctor M64 thankfully had the foresight to include a fast travel station that'll get you back to previous areas in a flash, making backtracking short and sweet while still making the game more open-ended than previously. AM2R also introduces a few new areas that were never in the original game. Only one of them is fully sized, but it's easily the remake's best addition. Compared to the more modular temples of the original, the new distribution center feels more like something you'd see in Super or Zero Mission, which I think series veterans will enjoy. Boss battles have seen a substantial improvement. Metroids present a more interesting challenge than previously, as their weak points are much more specific. Instead of just pelting them with missiles and hoping for the best, you'll have to learn each form's AI and exploit it, which can take some time. The first time I fought Zeta and Omega Metroids, I got my ass kicked, but once I memorized their attack patterns, they're actually really easy to kill. Similar to Zero Mission, AM2R brings a number of original bosses to the table. Each of the Chozo facilities features a unique boss, some of them completely original, and others recreations of bosses from other Metroid games. They provide a decent challenge while not being brutally difficult, and help to bring the second game up to the standards of the rest of the series. So, in my original script, I was going to offer some criticisms of AM2R, just to mention the few technical or design issues I happened to come across. But, wouldn't you know it, right as I'm editing this very review, AM2R version 1.1 comes out and fixes almost every issue I had. This weird snafu with the spider ball tracking at the Hydro Station? Fixed. The balancing on the Omega fights? Fixed. The god-awful slog backwards through the final tunnel if you need to backtrack for 100%? Fixed. Really, AM2R is practically perfect from my perspective. The only complaint I still have is the fact that you still can't see your completion rate from the game menu, which is really annoying seeing as the Prime Trilogy and Other M made that a standard feature. There's no way to know whether you got 100% or not without exiting to the file select or finishing the game, which is just unnecessary. All of the previous 2D games are guilty of this, and it's something that really irks me. Ultimately, this isn't a huge deal so much as it is a minor grievance I'd like to see addressed in a version 1.2. 1.2, assuming that ever happens. So, remake or rebreak. How well does Another Metroid 2 remake compare to the original Metroid 2 Return of Samus? AM2R is a beautifully crafted remake that perhaps supersedes even Metroid Zero Mission in its sheer scale and scope. The updated graphics are gorgeous, the new soundtrack is a welcome addition to the series' musical portfolio, the controls are tighter and more responsive, and the game world has been reimagined and fleshed out from the ground up into something that even rivals the Prime trilogy. Top that off with the introduction of power-ups from newer Metroid games, the implementation of a map system, the addition of several new areas, new power-up locations to incentivize revisiting earlier areas, and the creation of all new boss battles, and you've got the best Metroid game since Zero Mission launched in 2004. AM2R is simply a masterclass in game design and represents some of the best gameplay the series has ever had to offer, and for that reason, it deserves my highest honor. Replays. I reserve this score for only the best of the best, the remakes that improve and add so much that it renders the original version completely obsolete. Really, besides the fact that you still can't see your completion rate from the menu, I really don't see how this remake could get any better. It's important to note that to some extent, an amazing remake can only be as great as its original was lackluster, and that's unfortunately the case for the Game Boy original. While it may be one of the most important games in the series story-wise, it hasn't aged especially well, and it's not something I can recommend to everyone. Like I said, I respect the legacy of this game and understand its significance, but that doesn't make it a great game worth playing today. That's why I can feel confident in saying that I will never play the Game Boy version again. AM2R has simply superseded it, and I look forward to playing and replaying the game to learn all the speedrunning tricks and show off my skills. And now to address the elephant in the room. Nintendo, being the copyright Nazis they usually are, decided to remove the official download host to AM2R a mere day after the project's release. Legally, I understand they're in the right to do so, but seeing as this is the same company that uses copyright as a pretext to trample on content creators' fair use and to bully its fan communities, I can only see this move as an extension of the same mindset. Nintendo has had 8 years to learn of this project and shut it down, but it's only now that AM2R is giving the fans something to chew on after 6 years without a proper sequel that they suddenly care about this franchise again.
If I may interject here, I'd just like to remind the folks at home that Nintendo didn't greenlight Federation Force because they thought it's what the fans wanted. Kensuke Tanabe wanted to make a co-op shooter on the 3DS, and the idea of making it a Metroid Prime game came after. Apparently, the resources aren't available to develop a proper Metroid at this time, but I guarantee you that if Other M had sold better, Nintendo would be singing a different tune right now. But really, Nintendo mistreating its beloved IP is nothing new if you've seen my recently released review of Metroid Prime Federation Force or my upcoming video on the Metroid series itself.
I couldn't have said it better myself, hey? Doctor M64's latest blog entry has helped me to come to peace with the situation. He isn't mad, and that's after 10 years of developing this game from scratch, so why should I be? The game is still trading hands on the internet, and like I said earlier, Hwasti did release a version 1.1 with a ton of small improvements. AM2R belongs to the fans now, and because of that, I'm confident it will live on to become an integral part of the series, whether Nintendo likes it or not. While unlikely, I hope they'll see how excited the fans were about this remake, and finally consider making a new proper Metroid installment. After all, the reason Other M sold poorly wasn't because people hate Metroid, as Nintendo seems to think. It's because the game got lukewarm reviews and wasn't what the fans wanted, and history is poised to repeat itself with Federation Force later this month. Federation Force is a harmless spin-off, but what the series needed after the mixed reception of Other M was a return to form, not a side project. I'd better wrap things up here, because I'm just rambling at this point. If you can track down a safe download link for AM2R, then I'd absolutely recommend it. I'm not going to post any links here because I don't want to get myself in trouble over this. Sorry to say, but you're going to have to do some poking around on your own. I'd like to end things by saying a few words to Doctor M64, if he ever happens to see this video. Tengo que pedirle disculpas para mi español, porque hace un rato que lo hablo regularmente. Me gustaría agradecerle para hacer esta nueva versión de Metroid II. Fue una bendición que jugar un Metroid verdadero después de 6 años sin juego oficial. Espero que encuentre éxito en su futuro como diseñador de videojuegos. Hasta la próxima misión. Until next time, I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and I hope you all enjoyed the review.